It was an ordinary day in a quiet neighborhood when something shocking happened that no one could have anticipated. A young boy, no older than 10, was walking along the sidewalk, his clothes slightly worn, but his smile bright as he hummed a tune to himself. Out of nowhere, a police officer pulled up in his patrol car. The boy froze as the officer stepped out, his face stern and voice commanding. The tension in the air was immediate, but no one could have guessed what would happen next. The officer approached the boy and began questioning him harshly, as if the child were guilty of some unspoken crime. Passers-by glanced curiously, but no one intervened. Then, in a moment that left everyone stunned, the officer grabbed the boy by the arm and dragged him toward a nearby trash can. Ignoring the boy's protests and frightened pleas, the officer lifted him and tossed him into the filthy bin as if he were nothing more than garbage. The crowd that had gathered was too shocked to react, unsure of what to make of the officer's actions. But just as people started murmuring in disbelief, something unexpected happened. A well-dressed man appeared at the scene, his sharp suit and commanding presence silencing the growing whispers. The man's expression turned from confusion to anger as his eyes landed on the boy in the trash can. He marched straight up to the officer, who suddenly turned pale. The tension hit its peak when the man spoke just one sentence. What he said made the officer stagger backward, his knees giving out as he collapsed on the pavement. The crowd gasped, and the air was filled with a mix of disbelief and curiosity. What could this man have said that would make the officer react so dramatically? As the officer lay on the pavement, his face drained of color, the well-dressed man's piercing gaze didn't waver. The crowd was frozen, unsure whether to step in or stay silent. The boy, still trembling and visibly shaken, cautiously peeked out from the trash can. His small hands gripped the edges as he tried to process the whirlwind of events. The man turned to him, his expression softening as he reached out to help him climb out of the bin. It was clear they knew each other, but how remained a mystery to everyone watching. The tension only grew as murmurs rippled through the crowd. Who was this man? Why did his presence provoke such a reaction from the officer? No one could answer, but the unease in the air was undeniable. The officer, now regaining some of his composure, scrambled to his feet. He looked both horrified and desperate, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "I didn't know," he stammered, his voice shaking. But the man's cold, unforgiving stare silenced him once more. Meanwhile, whispers in the crowd grew louder. "That man looks familiar," one person said. "Isn't he some big-shot businessman or something?" Another added. The man ignored the chatter, instead kneeling to check on the boy. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly, his tone a stark contrast to his earlier demeanor. The boy shook his head, but didn't speak, his wide eyes filled with fear. The officer's radio crackled, but he didn't move. His hands were trembling as if he were trying to figure out his next move. The man finally stood, his imposing height and calm authority making the officer look even smaller. He took a step closer to the officer, his voice low but firm. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" he asked, each word heavy with meaning. The officer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The crowd leaned in closer, desperate to hear what would happen next. The man's question lingered in the air, unanswered, as the officer took a step back, his face pale and drenched with sweat. The crowd was now fixated on the unfolding scene, and phones began appearing in hands, ready to record whatever happened next. The boy, still clutching the man's hand, clung to his side, his small frame shaking. The man finally broke the silence, his voice sharp and cutting. "Do you treat every child this way, or did you think no one would notice this time?" His words were like a blade, each syllable slicing through the officer's fragile composure. Meanwhile, an elderly woman in the crowd stepped forward hesitantly, her wrinkled hands gripping her purse. "That boy doesn't deserve this," she said, her voice quivering but determined. "I've seen him around the neighborhood. He's a good kid. Always polite, always helping out." Her words seemed to shift the mood in the crowd, with murmurs of agreement rippling through. The officer's panic deepened as he realized there were witnesses, and their voices were turning against him. In another corner of the scene, a young woman in a business suit discreetly dialed her phone. She glanced at the man, clearly recognizing him, and whispered, "It's him. He's here. You need to come quickly." Whoever was on the other end of the call seemed to understand the urgency, and she slipped back into the crowd, her actions unnoticed by most, but not by the man. He caught her eye briefly, his expression unreadable, before turning back to the officer. The officer stammered again. "It was a misunderstanding, I swear. I didn't mean." But the man cut him off, his voice icy. "A misunderstanding? You threw a child into a trash can like he was nothing. That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice." His words hung heavy in the air, and the officer seemed to shrink under their weight. The boy's small voice suddenly broke through the tension. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, looking up at the man with wide, tear-filled eyes. "I was just playing with my friends." The man knelt down again, his expression softening as he placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "I know," he said gently, "and this shouldn't have happened to you." From a distance, sirens began to wail, their sound growing louder with every passing second. The crowd shifted uneasily, unsure of what was about to unfold. The man stood back up, his gaze never leaving the officer. "You don't know who I am," he said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet fury, "but you're about to find out." The officer's breath hitched, his eyes darting between the man and the approaching police cars. The crowd, now fully captivated, waited with bated breath for what was coming next. As the wailing sirens grew louder, the officer's panic deepened. His eyes darted toward the police cars approaching, their flashing lights reflecting off the tense faces in the crowd. His hands trembled, and he instinctively reached for his radio, but his voice faltered. The man stood tall, unmoving, his piercing gaze locked on the officer. The boy clung to the man's leg, his wide, tear-filled eyes silently pleading for the safety he desperately needed. The young woman in the business suit stepped forward again, this time no longer discreet. She pushed through the crowd with purpose, holding her phone to her ear. As the first police car screeched to a halt, two officers stepped out. They looked around, assessing the scene with professional detachment, until their eyes landed on the man. Instantly, their demeanor shifted. The tension in their bodies gave way to shock, and they exchanged hurried whispers before approaching with cautious respect. "Sir," one officer said, his voice low but steady, "we didn't realize." He hesitated, glancing at the boy and then at the panicked officer who had now gone pale. The crowd sensed the shift, and whispers rippled through the onlookers. "Who is he?" someone murmured. "Why are the cops acting like that?" The man said nothing, allowing the weight of the moment to build. The officer who had thrown the boy into the trash can now looked as though he wanted to disappear. Beads of sweat rolled down his forehead as he stumbled over his words. "I didn't know, I swear. It wasn't what it looked like. I didn't mean." "Enough," the man interrupted, his voice calm but chilling. He gestured toward the two arriving officers. "Do your job. Take his badge and place him under arrest." The crowd gasped audibly, and the young boy looked up at the man, his fear momentarily replaced by awe. Before anyone could react, another car pulled up, a sleek, black vehicle that seemed out of place amidst the chaos. A tall figure stepped out, exuding authority with every step. The whispers grew louder. The man in the suit locked eyes with the new arrival and nodded subtly, as if an unspoken agreement had been made. The officer who had been accused began to back away, shaking his head as though he couldn't believe what was happening. "Wait," the officer stammered, his voice cracking. "I didn't know who he was." The man turned slightly, his expression unreadable, and said in a low, cutting voice, "That's exactly the problem." The tension in the air was palpable, and the crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath as the climax of the confrontation loomed closer. Everyone was waiting for the moment when everything would come to a head, and for the revelation that would leave them speechless. Just as the officer began pleading for mercy, a voice cut through the tense silence like a knife. "Stop. Everyone turned to see an older woman stepping out of the crowd, her face weathered but determined. She was holding a faded photograph in her trembling hand. The man in the suit froze, his confident demeanor faltering for the first time. The woman looked directly at him, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "You think you're better than him? Do you remember what you did years ago?" The accused officer, who had been on the brink of collapse moments ago, suddenly regained his footing. "See," he said, grasping at this unexpected twist. "You're no different. We've all made mistakes." The man turned slowly, his expression hardening. He looked at the woman and then back at the officer. "You're wrong," he said quietly but firmly. "The difference is I learned from mine." But before he could continue, the sleek black car's back door opened, and another figure stepped out, a man with a commanding presence and a badge glinting on his chest. The murmurs turned into an audible gasp as the crowd recognized him as the city's highest-ranking law enforcement officer. He walked straight up to the man and extended a hand, ignoring the chaos around him. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officer who had assaulted the boy looked between the two men, realizing the situation was spiraling even further out of his control. The older woman stepped back, unsure whether her revelation had helped or made things worse. The boy, still clutching the man's sleeve, looked up at him with wide, questioning eyes. The crowd was now buzzing with speculation, wondering what connection these men had and how this new player would affect the unfolding drama. The stakes had just been raised, and the tension was thicker than ever. No one could predict what would happen next, but everyone knew they were witnessing something far bigger than they had anticipated. The man with the badge, the city's highest-ranking officer, stood silently as he looked from the boy to the accused officer. Then, without warning, he turned to the crowd and addressed everyone. "What happened here today is unacceptable. But before any judgment is passed, let's get the full truth." His commanding voice quieted the murmurs, and tension hung in the air as he fixed his gaze on the officer. "Why don't you explain what you thought gave you the right to throw a defenseless child into a trash can?" The officer, now drenched in sweat, stammered. "I didn't know who he was. I thought he was just some troublemaker." His excuse hung hollow in the air, drawing audible gasps from the crowd. The officer's eyes darted to the suited man, hoping for an ally, but none came. The suited man's expression had hardened into stone, and even the boy could sense that the tide had fully turned. Before anyone could speak again, the older woman who had revealed the man's past stepped forward once more. "You may have learned from your mistakes," she said, pointing at the suited man, "but have you taught anyone else to do the same? You've spent years building your power, but what good is it if you let this happen under your watch?" The suited man looked at the woman, then at the boy, who clung to his side, and finally at the officer standing frozen in fear. With a deep breath, he turned to the high-ranking officer. "Arrest him," he said, his voice cold. The officer's face turned pale as two uniformed men moved to cuff him. The crowd watched in stunned silence as justice seemed to unfold in real time. Just as the boy smiled, believing the nightmare was over, the older woman spoke again. "Wait." She reached into her bag and pulled out another photo, this one more recent. "You're not done. You need to face the truth about who this boy is." She handed the photo to the suited man, who visibly recoiled at what he saw. The boy leaned closer, curious, and gasped as he recognized himself in the photo, standing next to the woman and another man, who bore an unmistakable resemblance to him. "He's my grandson," the woman said softly, her voice breaking. "The son of the man you abandoned." The suited man stumbled back, the weight of her words hitting him like a tidal wave. The boy looked up at him, his wide eyes filled with both hope and confusion. The man knelt, his facade of power crumbling, and whispered, "I didn't know. I never knew." The climax had left the crowd speechless. The officer was led away in handcuffs, but the true resolution lay in the connection that had just been uncovered, a revelation that changed everything. As the suited man held the boy close, vowing to make amends, the high-ranking officer stepped forward and said, It's not just about one mistake. It's about fixing the system that allows these mistakes to happen. The crowd erupted in applause, but the suited man and the boy remained locked in their moment, a bittersweet beginning to a new chapter. The chaos of the day gradually settled, leaving behind a silence that felt almost heavy. The boy stood there, clutching the photo in one hand and his newfound family in the other. The suited man looked at him with a mixture of guilt and determination. "I can't change the past," he said, his voice trembling, "but I can promise you this: it'll be here for you, every step of the way." The boy hesitated, unsure of how to respond, but the sincerity in the man's eyes gave him hope. The older woman stepped forward, her stern expression softening. "You have a lot to make up for," she said quietly, "but this is a start. Don't waste it." Her words carried the weight of years of disappointment, but also the possibility of healing. She placed her hand gently on the boy's shoulder and smiled. "You're stronger than you know," she whispered to him. The officer, now taken away, served as a stark reminder to everyone of the dangers of unchecked power. The high-ranking officer addressed the crowd before dispersing them. "Today wasn't just about one person's actions," he said. "It's a wake-up call for all of us to do better, to ensure that everyone is treated with dignity and respect." His words resonated, leaving an impression that no one would forget anytime soon. As the crowd began to leave, the boy, his grandmother, and the suited man walked away together. It was a tentative step forward, but it was a step nonetheless. The boy glanced up at the man, wondering if this truly marked a new beginning. The man seemed to sense his thoughts and gave him a small, reassuring smile. Sometimes change doesn't come in grand gestures. It begins in small, quiet moments where people choose to be better. For the boy, it was the beginning of a story he never expected, a story of forgiveness, growth, and the hope of a brighter future.